Well, it's a joy to have Bob Lepine on the Disciple Making Parent podcast today. Bob has been the co-host of Family Life Today for the past 28 years. He's been heard by millions around the world. Bob and his wife, Marianne, are the parents of 5 adult children, and they live in Little Rock, Arkansas. And Bob's also the teaching pastor of Redeemer Community Church. And the reason I've invited him, he's the author of Love Like You Mean It, the heart of a marriage that honors God. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, Bob, thanks for coming on and talking to me.
Chap, this is a treat. Thank you for the invitation. Looking forward to this.
Well, this is great. I just want to start by telling you how much I appreciate the ministry of Family Life. So it's meant a lot over the years. In fact, my wife and I, who will celebrate 33 years this July, went to our first weekend to remember as an engaged couple in Boston 32 years ago. So 33 years ago. So I really appreciate the ministry. I have to tell you that interviewing a professional radio, announcer is a little bit intimidating. So I have to.
I've been asking questions for a living for a long time. So I don't feel intimidated by that. This is just a great conversation here.
Well, let's talk about what do you see as the state of marriage in the U.S. today? So I'm sure you get a lot of feedback from Family Life. You're a pastor on the ground. Your context is in Arkansas, but what are some things that you see have stayed the same? And what are some things that perhaps are unique to here we are in 2021?
Well, I think back over 28 years of being on Family Life Today, and the landscape has changed in some ways dramatically. In other ways, as you mentioned, some issues go back all the way to the garden. So there are some underlying issues that won't change. But 28 years ago, we never thought the definition of marriage would be tinkered with as it has been over the last couple of decades. I think what I've seen happen is the culture has done a great job of catechizing people to a new understanding of what love and marriage are all about. The old accepted common traditional pathway from meeting somebody to marriage went like this. You met somebody, you went on a date, you started going out on more dates, you decided to date exclusively, you got engaged, you got married, you moved in together, had sex, and had kids. Well, today, the common pathway is you go out on a date, you may go out on a second or third date, you have sex, you decide to date exclusively, you move in together, you may have kids, then you get engaged and you get married. I mean, more often than not, when couples get to the altar, more than 60% of them have already lived together prior to marriage. So we've adopted a new do it our own way approach to how you begin a marriage relationship. And I think the implications for that is we carry into marriage then. We're just supposed to do it whatever way seems natural or instinctive or right to us. And that's the genesis of so many problems. Now, the divorce rate has actually been going down in recent years. Part of the reason for that is because couples are waiting later to marry, and couples are living together outside of marriage. And so I think there are fewer divorces because there are fewer marriages, or marriages occurring later in life. And that goes back to your first question, which is what stayed the same? What stayed the same is that when you step into a marriage and the foundation is your own wisdom and your own passions and your own appetites being what fuels your marriage, that's a recipe for a bad marriage relationship. And yet that's why a lot of people, pop songs and Hallmark Channel have taught us this is what love and marriage is supposed to look like. And we bought into that. And as a consequence, I think our understanding of what marriage is weaker. I think our understanding of what love is weaker. That's why I wrote Love Like You Mean It, to try to say, let's start to think biblically about love rather than adopting the cultural definition.
Well, let's talk about that. I was going to ask you why you wrote it, and you bring up an interesting point. I wonder, I think back to my parents' generation who were married in the 1950s and then had me in the 60s. And there was not a lot of, as I understand it, Christian family help. And yet it seemed like in some ways, because of some of the cultural baggage that came to these couples, endurance, sacrifice. There were a number of things that there was somewhat of a Christian influence, and it seems like that has fallen away, and with it, perhaps this definition of, well, what actually is love? So yeah, talk about why you wrote the book.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I've heard Tim Keller talk about the fact that a generation ago, we were not a Christian nation. I think we just have to acknowledge that there has been a strong Christian influence in American culture, but we don't want to go back to the 50s or the 60s because there were sin patterns at work there that are dysfunctions. And many of us grew up in homes where mom and dad may have stayed together, but they were isolated from one another and there were all kinds of dysfunctions. So I don't want any of our viewers or listeners to hear me saying we need to go back to the good old days. We need to go back to the Bible days. We need to go back to what the Bible has to say about this. But what there was a generation ago was we lived under the influence of Christian thinking, so that even non-Christians still had a Christian way of thinking about love and marriage. But you interject what happened in the 60s with the social upheaval and the revolution and the redefining of so many things, and look at how culture has morphed over the last 50 years. And we have jettisoned much of that Christian way of thinking about things to say, maybe there's a better way. Maybe we should experiment. Maybe we should try some new forms and strategies. I actually, this book I came to because I had preached a series in our church going slowly through the definition of love in 1 Corinthians 13 and preached about it in a broad general sense, how all of us are to be characterized by love as followers of Christ. But I got done preaching and I thought, I spend so much time thinking about marriage and family. I really should go back and look at that and apply it more specifically to the husband-wife relationship. What does it mean not just to be generically a patient person, but what should patience in marriage relationship look like? So I sat down with my notes from my sermons and I looked at this and my background on marriage, and I said, let's walk through this. So many couples have had this passage read at their wedding and they thought, oh, that's so sweet. And that sounds so warm. It sounds like a poem. Well, it's actually a rebuke from the Apostle Paul to a carnal church that was not walking in love and saying, you guys have got it all wrong. When we read 1 Corinthians 13, rather than reading it like this, reading love is patient, love is kind, we should read it like this. Love is patient, love is kind. This is a locker room. This is a coach saying, you guys, we got to start doing it the right way. Love is patient and kind. It's not self-seeking. It doesn't keep a record of wrongs. Come on. That's how I think we need to read that passage.
A little raised voice there, a little emotion. Well, that may influence me the next wedding I do and read that passage there. So I love that. And particularly I love that connection you made, because part of what undergirded the disciple making parent was this sense that there's a lot of verses that we can apply to our parenting. And so there you did the same thing. You say 1 Corinthians 13, you preached it, and it is the context in 1 Corinthians is the church. Right. And yet, the first and hardest place to live out the gospel is in our home. Our spouse is our nearest neighbor if we're married. And so certainly those verses, apply to me thinking, okay, let me think about my spouse. And sometimes there's this disconnect and say, okay, yeah, 1 Corinthians 13 applies to church, but not my spouse.
Yeah, I had an aha moment on this many years ago. And in fact, when I came to Family Life back in 1992, Dennis Rainey asked me the question. He said, does marriage and family make you weep and pound the table? And I smiled at him and I said, theology makes me weep and pound the table. I get excited about understanding who God is, understanding what the Bible teaches. I said, to the extent that marriage and family is on the heart of God, Yes. Well, what I didn't realize when I said that was the extent to which marriage and family is on the heart of God. I kind of saw it like I think a lot of people say. What does the Bible teach about marriage? Well, Ephesians 5, 1 Peter 3, there's the Genesis passages. You got a little bit here and there. Then one day I'm reading the great commandment again. And Jesus, what's the greatest commandment? It's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets can be summed up in this. And I realized everything in the Bible is either talking to us about how to love God or how to love one another. And the parts that are talking to us about how to love one another all apply to marriage and family first before they apply anyplace else. So all of a sudden I thought the Bible has a ton to say about, as you said, parenting, about marriage, about the most important relationships in our life. That was revolutionary in my understanding of what the Bible has to say about all of the things we're talking about.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I just that sufficiency of scripture, that application to our nearest neighbor. I just think that undergirds that what your ministry, my ministry is about, the idea of there's a lot in here about my nearest neighbor. But before we actually talk about get into that passage, I want us to talk about to the spouse who perhaps has an unresponsive spouse, because I think the temptation can be, consciously or unconsciously, and your book certainly doesn't do this, but the temptation can be on the Christian authors to promise this blessed home if you'll just do what I say. So if you'll just buy the Disciple Making Parent, your kids will turn out perfect. We talked about that in the Family Life interview. The same way, if you'll just read my book, Love Like You Mean, you'll have a perfect marriage. And yet, just as God's love for us originates in him, it doesn't matter our loveliness. So really one person can love the other unconditionally.
Yeah. Well, God demonstrated his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And I look at that verse and go, how does that apply to how, if I'm to love like Christ, and Jesus says, love one another as I have loved you. Well, how did he love us? While we were still sinners, he sacrificed for us. Now, I don't want to minimize the difficulty and the pain and the heartache. I mean, to be in an unequally yoked marriage situation where your spiritual passion, where you're spiritually mismatched, that's a very difficult place to be, because when we come together to become one in a marriage relationship, that oneness encompasses our personalities, it encompasses the things, our likes and our dislikes. It encompasses all kinds of attributes. When the spiritual oneness in a marriage is not connected, we can still have a warm relationship with somebody, but we are always aware that at the deepest level something is missing, and that's painful. That's hard. There's a lack there. And I've talked to husbands and wives who are in this situation. And what they've told me is they've had to learn to go to the Lord for that longing to be met, that he is a husband to the husbandless, that he is the one who will meet you in those times when you're longing for spiritual intimacy and your spouse is just unable to provide it. And then to remember that you're commanded to love regardless of the response of the other person. And I have to be careful. I get into this a little bit in the book, because your response is not to enable sinful patterns on the part of the other person. I don't want you to hear me say you're supposed to love somebody who is actively sinning against you. And by love, I mean just let them keep doing it. No, the most loving thing you can do to somebody who's actively sinning against you is to step in and help them break that sin pattern in their life, right? Call the police if you need to because they're abusive, or get some help or get some counseling so that their anger or their passivity, whatever the issues are, you want to work on those issues. But you do it from a framework of not my happiness is the goal, but your sanctification or your justification. My goal is that you'd come to know Christ, and I'm going to love you and try to help you, not out of anger or frustration, but out of a heart of compassion.
Yeah, that's great. And you just brought up, I think to me, what's often misunderstood is the the many facets of love. So if the greatest command is love God and love your neighbor, then all the commands in the scriptures that are horizontal are love commands. So rebuking is a coming from a heart of love. So certainly that's I love how talking about that there are many facets, and it certainly doesn't include being passive when in regards to abuse. And I think
admonishing one another comes from a heart of love. You read the First Thessalonians 5 passages where it says, admonish the idle. That's from a heart of love. You don't do it because you're superior or self-righteous. You admonish the idle to try to help the idle with what they need help with. So yeah, you're exactly right on that.
And I also related to that, just thinking about love in the sense, if we are living for eternity, and there's so much done in secret that will only be revealed in eternity. And so knowing, okay, I'm going to love this unresponsive spouse in a way that honors the Lord. No one's going to see me except on the final day. And I'll hear Jesus say, well done, good and faithful servant. So this command, love one another, you've heard the saying, or you've probably said it as well. It's not a 50-50, it's 100-100. Right. And so I'm going to do my 100%. I don't know what the outcome is going to be, if it's going to be one of those idyllic or marriages. We Sharon and I have some friends who they just seem to get along great, and we're just like, oh man, that's not us. We have to work at our marriage. So
well, but you work at it as unto the Lord, and that's your whole point in all of this. You're doing your 100%, not to see if this is going to fix things, or until you're happy, or at some point you're going to throw in the towel, say, okay, I'm done, I give up. You do your 100% as unto the Lord, knowing He is pleased with your sacrifice in that situation. And that's the goal, that the Lord would be pleased in this, regardless of the change that may or may not occur in your marriage.
Well, that's great. Yeah, let's go through these verses and just highlight a couple. Really, again, many motivations. One is our spouse. Our as a disciple-making parent, my kids are watching my marriage. They're watching my reaction, and it also applies to how I interact with them. So let me just read this passage, and then you've got chapters on a number of different of these verses, and I want to ask you about them. So 1 Corinthians 13, love is patient and kind. It does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. I want to ask you about a few of those, but before I do you remember, as you preached the series or wrote the book, any one in particular that's stuck out to you?
Well, what I remember is, first of all, somebody had told me years ago, they said, read that passage and take out the word love and put in your own name, and just do that as a diagnostic. Bob is patient. Bob is kind. Bob is not arrogant. You don't get very far before you go, whoops, I'm lying. So, it's where it's a good diagnostic to say, is the fruit of love showing up in my life? Would people say that these things are true about me? I think what started out for me was just the whole issue of patience. It was fascinating to me that this, and of course you've written on this subject as it relates to parenting, but here's where Paul starts. If you're going to describe love to somebody else, if we got a room of 100 people and we said, just give me the first word that comes to mind. Love is who? How many in that 100 people would say patient? First thing. I don't think anybody would. And yet that's where Paul starts. And of course, you go back to your old King James version, and it's love suffereth long. Love is long suffering. That's what the word patience means. It
actually gives a lot of fruit, or a lot of color to the word patience.
Yeah, it makes it a more rugged word. Patience is kind of like, I'll grit my teeth and bite my tongue. and there's an endurance to it. But suffering long means most of us will say, I will endure until it gets too bad, or until it goes on for too long. Well, love goes longer and suffers more. Now, again, we got to be careful. We're not talking about physical suffering. We're not talking about love hangs on in the midst of there being physical abuse. That's not a factor here at all. When you're experiencing physical abuse, you get godly counsel around you. You call the police if you need to call the police. You protect yourself, and you have your abuser held accountable for his abuse or her abuse, because you're trying to help them break what is a deep-rooted sin pattern in their own life. But the idea of patience means that, for Marianne, the idea of patience means that there are annoying habits that I have that she has talked to me about that I still revert to under pressure or without thinking. I do it. Here's an example. I woke up a few months ago and came downstairs, and Marianne said, the garage door was open all night. Now, this is not the first time that she has mentioned that to me. And I have tried to be more diligent in making sure that I've got the garage door closed, but I knew this was on me. I'd left it open. I'd not checked it. And I also knew that, I mean, I look at that and go, well, hey, it's great. The garage door was open and nothing happened. We live in a safe neighborhood. My wife, on the other hand, is going, I feel insecure going to bed at night, knowing that the back door hasn't been checked or the garage door hasn't been checked. So her suffering long, you may say, well, that's not really suffering. Well, you add enough of those things on where you feel threatened or insecure, or there's a level of suffering. And patience says, I'm going to still love you in the midst of your weaknesses, your failures, your flaws, the habits I wish you would correct, the sin patterns that are hard, that bring pain into my own life. I'm still going to love you in the midst of that and be your ally. And I'm not going to give up on you. I'm here for the long run. In fact, I think, this passage starts with love is patient. It ends with love bears all things, endures all things. I really think it's putting a bookend on the whole idea of love, that endurance and patience and hanging in and going the distance, love never gives up is where it ends. And I think that's part of what Paul's calling us to, the permanence of love. It's not something that we'd say, I'm going to love you as long as it's good for me, or as long as I feel it, or as long as life is okay. It's me saying, I'm going to love you. We tell couples this when we marry them: for better, for worse, for sickness and health, rich or poor, bad stuff's coming. You're pledging now that you're hanging in when the bad stuff comes.
That's really good. I mean, there's so much there that you talked about. I think just one thing that came to mind is going through this passage. I've often gone in this passage because, you do the mental math in those situations, and you're like, well, I was 10% wrong, but she was 90% wrong. And then you're able to read this whole passage and say, wait a minute, like you said, was chap patient, was I kind, and therefore I can repent. But it's interesting that you talk about the whole endurance thing, because that's just so important. I think it's a true story that's told about Billy Graham's wife, who said he traveled so much. Did you ever think about divorce? And she said, divorce, never. Murder, yes. So the idea that we are together, and talk a little bit about that. So you've got your last chapter about love being tenacious. I think of the Bonhoeffer quote, who said, today, the love makes the covenant. Tomorrow, the covenant makes the love. I mean, we've both been married a while. Just talk about that, just that tenaciousness as an aspect of love.
Yeah, I think that tenacity, the saying, I will together with you bear up under what life is going to throw at us. I'm going to bear up under your weaknesses and your failings. I will. The bearing up means I will shoulder the weight with you. When weight comes on us, I will be here to help lift it up. And then the endurance idea is that, and I will do that not just once, not just on a short-term basis, but I'm going to do it over and over and over again. And people will hear that and they'll go, but you don't know my situation and you don't know how long. And I don't. And I'm not trying to put gloss on and just say, well, it's going to be easy. Here's what I would say. God is the one who has called us to this, and God is the one who has said, in these circumstances, I will be your source of hope and strength and encouragement. I will be the one who will, you come to me with all of that frustration and all of that pain and all of that hurt, and I will meet you there, and I will comfort you, and I will strengthen you so that you can go back and do this. I wrap up this book, chap, by talking about how we cannot dispense to others what we have not received first. We can't have flowing out of us what is not being poured into us. And so when we are low on love in our marriage, the reason we're low on love is because we have not gone to the source and say, Lord, fill me up. Lord, pour your love into me. We go back to the gospel as our source of hope and strength and love, and then we demonstrate it to others, to our spouse, out of the overflow of what God pours into our lives. And that's where endurance and bearing come from, not from your own strength. You try and do it in your own strength, you'll get crushed. And the enemy knows that, and he'll throw, if he sees you relying on your own strength, he'll just pour on the weight until he crushes you. But when you are bearing up with God's strength girding you, you can bear all things, believe all things, hope all things, and endure all things.
That's great. Yeah, Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 1, this came so that I would learn to rely on God.
Yes.
And yeah, so that's the source there. Well, talk just a little bit about kindness. So personally for me, that was the chapter that kind of surprised me. And I think because in my head, I did a little switch. Whenever I heard the word kind, I thought of gentleness.
Yeah.
And talk a little bit about the
a
word kindness means.
A lot of people, and I think I'm like this too. I think of niceness. I think of somebody who's just polite and smiles and is easy to get along with. And I think there's an aspect of that to kindness. But this is a word that is a work boot word. It's not a loafer word. It's you strap on your work boots in order to be kind to somebody. And one of the things I realized as I was working on this book, the most often mentioned attribute of God in the Old Testament. If you were to say, when the Bible describes God, what's the word that is most often used to describe him? It's the Hebrew word hesed, which is the word that we translate his loving kindness. And so we serve a God who is known for his proactive goodness toward us. And that's what kindness is. It's not reactive niceness. It's proactive goodness. It's where I say, my goal in our relationship is your good, and I will sacrifice my own desires to see you thrive, to see you grow, to see you flourish in what's going on. That's a kind person, is somebody who puts you above themselves, will sacrifice in order for your good to happen. And they do it proactively. They're intentional. They're thinking about, how can I do good to you today, rather than just saying, well, if the occasion happens, I'll try to respond with goodness, rather than initiating it out of my own sense. And that's a much more robust word than just our normal word that we translate kindness. But that's God's kindness. His loving kindness toward us is proactive abundance and blessing and grace lavished on us.
That's so helpful. I just think, even as you're talking, I'm finding myself substituting nice, in that. And just, I don't know if we need a different English word, or goodness or something, if the word kindness has been hijacked, but that goodness, I'm proactively going to act for your good. Like I said, that was the chapter that I felt like, oh man, that's really off in my thinking. So talk about, let's finish up with just a couple of different characteristics. in the chapter on humility, you said the less attention you pay to yourself, the more the more you're able to pay attention to the needs of others.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I think of myself as proud toward my spouse or need to be humble, but yeah, talk a little bit about humility.
Yeah, humility is one of those. I mean, if pride is at the core of most sin, and I think it is, humility is the antidote to that. And humility is not thinking less of yourself; it's thinking of yourself less, as someone has said. It's the idea that you have a correct appraisal of who you are as God has made you. I think we sometimes misunderstand humility as you got to think, oh, I'm not worth very much. I don't have much value or me. That's not humble. That's self-deprecating. Humble is somebody who has an accurate appraisal and says, I am a child of God. I'm created in the image of God. There's glory in all of that, but I'm also riddled with sin, and I'm proud, and I have this heart that is deceitful and wicked, and I know that about myself. And so I don't think, first of all, I don't think that life should revolve around me. And secondly, I don't think I'm always right on everything that I tend to think I'm right on. I mean, we think what we think because that seems right to us. But a humble person will say, that seems right to me, but I'm not always right. So I need to hear from others. I need to be corrected on this. And this is where I think we do have to, we can't be arrogant. Love is not arrogant. So humility is the opposite of that arrogance. And that arrogance is the idea that the world should revolve around me and I see everything accurately, and my views on things are always right. A humble person says, no, the world should not revolve around me. And my views are not always right. And I need to learn from others and need to stay teachable in a marriage relationship. When we have that posture toward one another, when we're in conflict in marriage, and our posture is, now look, this is what seems right to me, but I know I don't always see in 360, and I need to hear from you and broaden my thinking. So I'm here because I want to learn if I've got blind spots. If you're approaching conflict that way, it's going to go a lot different than if you're saying, you're wrong, I'm right, we need to do it my way, and why don't you just buckle under?
That's really good. We don't think of the words like that as manifestations of pride, but that's really what they are. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I've just read an author who said becoming a Christian is thinking differently about Christ and thinking differently about ourselves. And so that's really sort of what you're getting at here. That's really helpful.
Yeah. And
Well,
R.C. Sproul years ago, I remember him saying, most of us do not believe God is as holy as he really is. And most of us do not believe we are as sinful as we really are. And when you start to recognize both of those things are true, I need to recognize God is holier than I imagine, and I am more sinful than I really believe I am. That has a way of correcting and bringing humility to you and go, I need to step back for a minute and see things God's way instead of the way I tend to think about them.
well, let's finish up by looking. This is just a very convicting statement. Love is not rude. It is not irritable. It is not resentful. So you talk about two things, which I think really in the church, but then also just in our homes. So talk about being touchy, walking on eggshells, and then talk about the role of forgiveness in a marriage, not keeping a record of wrongs.
Yeah, to be easily provoked in marriage, to be easily the common word is triggered. I use the word touchy in the book because my mom used to talk about people who were touchy people, but they're people who are easily annoyed, easily provoked, easily irritated by things that the Bible says it's a man's glory to overlook a transgression. Somebody does something wrong, cuts you off in traffic, says something annoying and rude, it's your glory to give grace. Love covers a multitude of sins, pours grace on these transgressions. Again, that doesn't mean we enable them or excuse them. There are times you need to correct that stuff. But if I went around trying to correct every time my wife says something the wrong way in our marriage, we wouldn't have time for anything else. She wouldn't have time for anything else either if she was having to do it with me. So most of the time, we give each other grace. When I left the garage door open, Mary Ann gave me grace in that moment, rather than it becoming a 3-day conflict between us as a couple. So I think we have to learn how to cultivate. And here's where we have to learn how to put off our tendency toward irritability. And you do that in Colossians 3 by putting on kindness, compassion, humility, gratefulness. Colossians 3:12 is a great verse to memorize, to say, what's the antidote to irritability? Well, it's kindness and humility and compassion and all of the things that are talked about in this verse. We have to actively cultivate hearts that are going to respond to conflict in this way. And then we have to, you mentioned Billy Graham's wife, Ruth. One of my favorite quotes from her, she said, a great marriage is the union of two great forgivers. And I think that's absolutely right. The number one skill in a marriage that will best determine the long-term success of that marriage is your ability to resolve conflict and forgive one another. Because if you can't do that, you're going to be in isolation. If you can do that, you can move back toward intimacy and toward oneness. And so understanding what the Bible teaches about forgiveness, that it's a requirement for us as believers. When I speak at Weekend to Remember Marriage Getaways, I say we have a phrase that we use when we talk about forgiving another person. We talk about burying the hatchet. And I say, first, we ought to ask ourselves, what were we doing running around with a hatchet in our hand in the first place, right? And then the problem is so many people will bury the hatchet with the handle sticking out of the ground, which means it's half buried. But if I get into a conflict again, I know where it is and I'm going to go get it. I'm going to pull it back out of the ground. Now, forgiveness means giving up the right, the perceived right, to punish another person for how they wronged you. You give that up to God. You say, I'm going to let go of this. I'm not going to hold it against you. I'm not going to keep a record of wrongs. That's resentment, is keeping a record of wrongs. I'm not going to keep my list. I'm not going to come back to it. I'm not going to, in the middle of a conflict, pull up something that is still hurting me from 6 months ago and say, well, you remember the time you did this? That's keeping a record of wrongs. And love does not do that. When we say, I forgive you to another person, what we're saying is, I won't bring this up again. It's done between us. When God forgives us, he places our sin as far as the east is from the west, puts it behind his back, puts it at the bottom of the sea. The Bible says, remarkably, he remembers it no more. The omniscient God chooses to remember our sin no more. Forgiving your spouse is choosing to remember their sin no more. Never bring it up again. And I talk to couples and say, well, how does that, so forgive and forget, is that what you're saying? Well, if your spouse had an affair, you never have a day where you go, oh yeah, I forgot that you did. I mean, that's just with you. That's a reality. But it is choosing to pour grace on that and say, I'm not going to allow this to be a wedge between us. I've forgiven you. I'm pursuing reconciliation. There's been repentance. There's been, we've gone through a process and we're here. I'm releasing that, and I won't bring it up again and allow it to be a wedge in our relationship. And I'm going to trust God to heal the hurt in my own heart and rebuild trust in our relationship as a result of that.
Wow, this is really just a lot of good wisdom here. And I bet you feel like I do, is I've had to go back to this passage again and again. And I feel like over these 32 years, Sharon's love has deepened. My love has deepened. What do they say? Newly marrieds are often in love, with a picture that they have of the other person and themselves. I'm a pretty good person. She's pretty exciting. And yet over time, that covenant, keeping that love, going back, repenting, asking forgiveness. Really, I many times have gone back to 1 Corinthians 13 and just gone through that passage and said, yep, I failed in those areas. And so I really appreciate the writing you've done on this. So the book is Love Like You Mean It, The Heart of a Marriage That Honors God, and just walking us through really helpful ways, 1 Corinthians 13. So Bob, thanks for taking the time, and just thanks for sharing your wisdom.
Thank you, Chap. It's a treat to be on here. I hope folks will benefit from the book. And let me just mention, Family Life did a video series that's 10 15 or 20-minute sessions on each chapter from the book. So small groups can go through that with a workbook. And I think when you get together with other couples and you interact over these kinds of principles, I think that's where God does his greatest work, is in that community of one another, sharpening iron with one another. So I hope it'll be helpful for couples.
Thanks. That's great. We'll link to that in the show notes.
Thank you.